the original situation. So if the data is pretty much the same, then I think you have a problem with the conclusions that are being drawn by the data. The conclusions that you're drawing don't seem to apply to the Yuba, but the data seems to be the same. So I'm sure there's a reason for that, and I'd welcome knowing what it is. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I would suspect that the Yuba is, while it doesn't have a hatchery, it is a tributary to the Feather River. And Feather River fish turn up very far afield, including places like the Russian River, which is not even connected to the Central Valley. Due to this trucking issue, they go everywhere then. It disrupts their ability to home. So I think the data are coming in now that we'll find that the Yuba River is driven very heavily by what's going on in the Feather River and with Feather River Hatchery. There are some ideas people are working on right now about restoration actions in the Yuba that are very important, especially for spring Chinook. There's enormous potential for getting that basin back online. It's one of the bright spots potentially for spring run Chinook salmon. It would be a great thing for conservation and for fisheries. But right now it's a small part, and I think it is subject to the same problems of all the other tributaries. Yes?
You mentioned, is the microphone on? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. You mentioned the amount of resources going into river restoration and watershed management. It's always seemed to me that if you wanted to put a lot of people to work doing a lot of very diverse, interesting jobs, that getting really serious about restoring our riparian habitats at every scale, from the big rivers down to some of the smaller creeks, would generate benefits, both immediate by putting people to work, but then we have long-term health of the ecosystems. So I'm just wondering, is there a push towards using things like stimulus money or sort of a civilian conservation corps kind of approach to really getting the work done, because it could easily use an order of magnitude increase in the amount of resources going into it?
That's right. It's my impression that the Recovery Act stimulus funding, that some of that was spent on restoration actions. We'd like to see projects, though, that can restore the natural river functions, rather than people driving around with bulldozers trying to correct the river channel. River channels are self-correcting if they're given the right flows and sediment supplies. And those are much more sustainable solutions, that they're not cheap either. Anyway. Yes?
The problem with, if you have a salmon population crashes, salmon population supports the western forests.
That's right, yeah.
Because of the bears. It's a part of that nitrogen movement into further away from, and everything else that depends on that. So it's not just a salmon problem. It will be a much bigger problem for the whole western coast of the United States, and and Alaska, Canada.
That's a good comment. I actually had a slide about that I skipped over in the interest of time. But you're right. Yes.
We all marvel at the legendary ability of salmon to return to their natal stream in a pure nature. Maybe Alaska is an example, I guess. Now, hatchery fish don't have a natal stream, or at least one that they would identify with. I'm wondering just, and maybe this Yuba River data would be relevant, but I'm wondering if there's some effect on just the psyche of the fish, which has no natal stream. I mean, I'm just asking.
Yeah, I don't. I look at them and I just don't get a sense one way or the other of their psyche.
They imprint by some, on their environment with perfectly understandable ways, but however that affects them, a fish which simply has no natal stream must have some pressure on it that has some effect.
They probably are confused when they come back, I would guess, as to where am I supposed to go now? Yeah.
General Motors.
Yes.
Yes, you had a vertical bar graph that showed 2 years, probably 2005, and the variation from 1.0, the historic norm. And when these fish got down to the bay, for those 2 years, there was a huge collapse. They were down to around 0.05.
Mm-hmm.
And then out in the ocean, whatever the other two bars were, they were also devastated, but not nearly as much, implying that fewer fish got to the ocean, but they did fairly well once they got there.
Okay.
And that would seem to say the ocean was rather kind to them.
No.
Certainly there was less competition.
So that age, the first point where did everyone hear the question? So the point of that slide was that first bars that were very low, it actually included the interval from entry to the bay to age 2 in the ocean. So yeah, it does. If you were correct,
They made it to 2, they did okay.
yeah, that's a very good point. Yeah, it seems like once they got over this early hump, which we actually think was probably just the first few months of entry into the ocean, then they were okay. You know, the survivors did okay. Yes, in the back.
I didn't get a sense of if there was one big thing to do. For example, what if we said to hell with the farmers and we just got all the water coming down through the rivers and and the theory that we'd have so much salmon then we'd just eat fish. Would that be the materially biggest thing that could improve the situation? Or is it so fragmented we really don't know what the cause of the cycles are?
Well, I think we do know. Unfortunately, it isn't that simple. It's kind of a death by 1,000 cuts problem. So the flows, if you just turned up the flows, that alone wouldn't solve the whole problem. It might help some. It probably would. But the big problem is the rivers are channelized and leveed. Juvenile salmon, especially these fall Chinook, are very dependent on floodplains, at least naturally. So if you remove the levees, then maybe you'd be getting somewhere as well. And for these other runs of Chinook salmon, the dams are the big problem. They can't get to the habitat that they need. So if you took out the dams, took out the levees, and let the river do its thing, the salmon would do great. I'm certain of that. But people are living in these areas now. It's a lot of valuable real estate, and we need the food too. So it's not a simple problem. Yes? Sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't. Yeah. Well, okay. There are no fish ladders on these big dams in California. The dams are so high that people have not figured out how to get fish over them. Ladders don't work. There's a potential for elevators, effectively, where the fish can be trapped. Seriously, this is going to be pursued. The fish swim in and they're taken over, but it's not even that simple because the juveniles can't migrate through those reservoirs because they need the cue of the flow, and they're slack water reservoirs. So you really then need to catch the babies when they're coming back down to the lake and take those back down over the dam. But this is going to be tried. There are projects like this on the Willamette River in Oregon now, and it's on the charts for Shasta Dam up in the Sacramento. But that thing's 500 feet high or 450 feet high. There's no fish ladder that would work with that. But not to say that you couldn't get the fish over there if you wanted to. Yes?
You said that the salmon return at somewhere between 2 to 5 years.
Yes.
And so that would imply that maybe there's 4 or 5 clusters or schools of salmon.
Cohorts, yes.
Cohorts.
That's right.
Cohorts, okay. So, and it was 06 and 07 when the conditions were bad in the ocean. And you said that some of the ones that were older would have survived that 2-year period. So would that imply that 3 or 4 of the cohorts might still be quite healthy, and as they return now, you would expect things to sort of normalize out because of that wide range of cohort years?
Well, I think from these brood years of 2004, 2005, those are pretty well played out now. Now we're seeing, with this year they pretty much will be. Now we're seeing the following cohorts, which we think experienced better ocean conditions, but just when those started improving, we had the drought, which started in 2007. And we actually started measuring directly the survival of salmon in the river from Battle Creek, where Coleman Fish Hatchery is, to the Golden Gate, and it was dismal compared to what you see on the Columbia, which is a system with a lot of big dams and a lot of problems. We saw a tiny fraction of the survival there. So that doesn't bode well for the next few years until we have some wet years with good ocean conditions, and then things should come back. But it might be some years still of tough sledding. At the microphone there.
Yeah, you hear Schwarzenegger, can't pronounce his name, talking that you need more dams. And on the other hand, you read articles in the newspaper about they're going to try to remove dams. And what is the possibility of some of these dams actually being removed? And would it be, would that be harmful in terms of, reservoirs and so forth? What's your opinion on that?
There are some dams that can be removed. They have a lifetime. They don't last forever. They fill up with sediment and they lose their function. And there are some dams whose primary purpose is controlling debris flows, and they're not really part of the water storage solution for California. So there are a number that are on the table for being removed or having these passage facilities installed, and that will help. There's also the prospect for building dams that are not on the river network. So they're what they call off-channel storage. And you have to pump the water to get the water into them, but there could be some improvements with things like that as well. Yes?
You've concentrated a lot on Sacramento River drainage. What is as an example, in my lifetime of fishing, salmon have been extirpated from the San Lorenzo River, and there used to be fair numbers of them to return. What is the potential for contribution of smaller streams like the San Lorenzo, the Russian, et cetera, to add back to the overall salmon stock?
In the long term, there's some. In the short term, those basins like the San Lorenzo in particular, they have a lot of their own problems. They're very different in nature. They have a lot more to do with forestry practices and the fact that all the big trees were taken out. People don't like when the big trees fall into the river, and it can create flooding for people who live along the riverbank. So they tended to remove them from the stream. And even with the best forest practices into the future, it takes a long time to grow the big trees, which then fall over into the river and create the kind of habitat that used to make the San Lorenzo so productive. So those efforts are underway, but it's going to be decades before those systems come back online. So that's the bad news with that. The Sacramento is different. It's not so dominated by forestry problems, which are really rampant elsewhere. It's really this water storage and delivery system, flood control, that it's not readily compatible with salmon, at least the way it's operated now.
There's a lot of salmon now that's farm grown, and what percentage of salmon that we eat is farm grown today?
I don't know those numbers off the top of my head, but I think it's quite high. I know for Atlantic salmon, the statistic that people bandy about is that for every 100 Atlantic salmon alive on the earth, only one of them is a wild salmon. And a lot of what you'd see in the market now that's just salmon is farmed Atlantic salmon. But then you can get Bristol Bay sockeye as well. Those are extremely abundant, and those are completely natural wild fish.
There's an interesting book called For Fish, and that has a lot to do with aquaculture versus stocking of the wild stocking of the fish. So it's
Is it good? I've seen it. It sounds very interesting, but I haven't read it yet.
Yeah, it has a lot to do with aquaculture.
Yeah.
So are the hatcheries going to start releasing fish in the river instead of trucking them again? I mean, I asked the Feather River Hatchery why they did that.
Yeah.
They were doing that about 5 years ago. Before that, they did release fish into the river. They told me it was in response to the pressure from ocean fishing to try to reduce the predation rate.
Yeah.
But of course, the fish are not imprinted in any way.
Yeah.
There's no survival of fish by going through the rivers.
So the question is, are they going to start releasing fish back to the river? And I'm afraid not until they're made to. It was actually quite disheartening. Even some people from Fish and Wildlife Service who are involved with Coleman Fish Hatchery, who in the past released all their fish to the river, in response to this crisis, due to the political pressure, started trucking a quarter of their production. And they don't even believe it helps. But they did it just because they were getting pressure and it looks like they're trying to do something.
Well, the fear is that it hurts.
Yeah, well, I think it does.
In fact, the Feather River fish that were taken down there ended up in the sack.
Yes.
The ones that did return
That's right.
Fished in that river 25 years. And over that 25-year period, although there've been ups and downs, it's been very stable. It's been a hatchery fishery. And it's only in the last 4 years that it just fell off the end of the earth. You can't find a salmon in that river in October.
Yeah, I don't think it's, oh, the trucking has something to do with it, but it's complicated. It would be better if they didn't do that, because the salmon, when they're allowed to go back to where they're born, they have the potential for adapting to those local conditions, and that's what builds this kind of diversity up within the population, within and among the populations. And when they are swimming all over the place and breeding with all of these other things, it erases that diversity, and that's actually seen. The Sacramento River is the only place where you see no spatially structured genetic diversity within the population. Everywhere else, it maps very closely to the river network, and that's gone in the Sacramento. It's not clear. You might argue that naturally over evolutionary time that there's been a lot of straying, because these rivers sometimes run pretty dry or hot in the summer, and the fish will go somewhere else if they can't get to where they want to go. So it might be a natural thing, but it's pretty intriguing. It's the only place where it's seen like that. And it's where trucking is the major deal. The Columbia has this, they barge them, but they can pump the water into the barges, and it's not quite as bad, perhaps.
But the Feather River has not changed in that 25 years. In fact, in the last 5 years, it's had higher flows than it had, in the 20 years previous. The water quality looks fine.
Yes?
If they were put back in the river, there'd be the possibility, would there not, that they could interbreed with the wild salmon, and that would help the health of their species?
They do that. Yeah, they are interbreeding, and it's a question of what. So there's gene flow from the hatchery to the wild and from the wild to the hatchery. And we'd like to see that gene flow going from the wild to the hatchery to keep that fitness up, but it's really going the other way right now because there's this huge mismatch in the size of the populations and the straying. So that dynamic's happening, but it's going the wrong direction. That's one of the things that could be perhaps corrected without a whole lot of upheavals to things that we'd like to see, I think.
So with that, I'll thank Steve for a fantastic talk. We have a couple of small gifts for you from SRI.
Oh, thank you.
Have a book about SRI and.
I have my coffee cup already, thank you.
Right. And even more useful,
okay.
a bottle of water. This
Excellent.
is from Roxrow. So
excellent.
Thank you. Thanks
so much.
again.
Well, thank you all for coming. I appreciate your interest.